one day, and they said to me, what do you think should be done? And I'm not quite sure where it came from, because I wasn't ready for the question, and it took me by surprise. But what I found coming out of my mouth and out of my heart, I said to them, listen, you know what we need to do? We need to get this country praying. And I said, you can do a lot of things after you've prayed, but you can do nothing until you have prayed. And I said, what we need is a 2-year chain of prayer, which will go 24 hours a day, non-stop, from now onwards. Well, I'll tell you, the next day, our phone at African Enterprise rang off the hook as people said, we want to sign up and we want to pray. And so we just got a big computer sheet, and we printed out every quarter of an hour for 2 years. And when we allowed people to take in and book their time, quarter of an hour, half an hour, 2 hours, a whole night, a whole week. Sometimes denominations would say, we'll take a week, or a city will say, we'll take this week or these 2 weeks. Or people who were in prison said, give us this. Little old ladies phoned in and said, we can't sleep at 2 and 3 in the morning, so you give us that. And it was absolutely awesome. I mean, everywhere you turned, people were praying. And I've had the privilege of sharing this story in several places. And in Ireland, and places like that, I said to them, listen, if you win the battle in the heavenlies in prayer, you will see the victory on the ground. Ephesians 6 says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but thrones, principalities, and powers, and against the forces of spiritual wickedness in high places. So if that is the real battle, you've got to neutralize that stuff in prayer, and really only intercessors fully understand that. And Paul writes, and he says, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds and the bringing of every thought captive to Christ. And that is sometimes the thing to remember when you come to these intransigent problems. Win the intercessory battle. And then you will see, other wonderful victories take place, on the ground. Now, out of that going around to leaders in 92, which we called From Africa with Love, one of the things we concluded was that many of these leaders were a lot closer to each other than they realized. A lot of the language was similar about peace and prosperity and reconciliation and, solutions and democracy and this and this and this. And so we concluded, would it not be tremendous as our little contribution? I remind you, beloved ones, that everybody under the sun was doing their bit. What I'm telling you now is not something, that's, heroics or anything like that. Everyone was doing their bit, and we were trying to do ours. And we felt out of this thing that the Lord was saying to us, gather some of these leaders together from left and right and get them away to have a time of dialogue with each other. And this idea was conceived of a series of dialogue weekends. In the end, there were 6 of these weekends with some 96 politicians who went through them. And we decided to go away to a place called Kolobe Lodge. I don't know whether any of you know it. It's a very beautiful game park just out here north of Pretoria, up by Falwater and that area. And we invited an assortment of leaders. They didn't have to be Christian. We just wanted senior leaders, whether they were Muslims or Jews or Hindus or Christians or atheists or whatever, but they were people of concern and influence who were in the action, and we wanted them to find each other in their common humanity. I've always believed that there's a tremendous amount can be achieved when people find each other in their common humanity before they rush to agenda. If you've got some tricky political issue, you to get all the people to the parties, go for a hiking weekend in the Drakensberg. They'll come back and then they'll solve the problem on Monday morning in about 2 hours. Because they find each other, they come to understand each other, friendships are established. And so we asked these people from the far right wing and the Tronik crowd and we didn't quite get the AWB, unfortunately. Mr. Tablanche put the phone down on me very vigorously, but we got pretty well everybody to the left of him, which still means, that you're really right over there on the right-hand side. And then right through and to the Central Committee of the Communist Party, the cabinet, members of the ANC leadership, and so forth. And we got together in groups of 15 or 20 leaders. And some of them were really quite nervous about this. And they said, Michael, what's going on here? What's your agenda? We've given up this weekend to come. And sometimes people came out of very heated situations. One of them, we started on the Friday evening when the AWB, I think it was, had just driven their tank through the glass windows of you remember that, of Kempton Park? And another one was just after the PAC had exploded their bombs in the sports club in King Williamstown. A number of whites and that had been killed. And so people came very, very tense. And some came with bodyguards, some came with revolvers, some came with AK-47s. I don't know what they thought the dialogue was going to be, Thought Hopalong Cassidy from the Wild West were going to have a shootout or something, the grand shootout in Colombia Ranch or something, and Lone Ranger and Honcho would come galloping over the hills or something, I mean, I don't know what they thought was going to happen. But, and in fact, one of the politicians' bodyguard, I just was sure he had a huge revolver on him because he was doing so much searching of everything all around. And I went into his room and I picked up his pillow. And underneath was a lethal-looking revolver. And I always regretted not doing it. I thought I should just take the revolver out and put a chocolate in John 3:16 and say, check with the management for your revolver. In the meantime, read John 3:16, Anyway, these politicians said, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, three things. Number one, we want everyone to share their autobiographies, their stories. Number two, we want each person to share their vision of a new South Africa. Number three, we want each person to share the steps that they believe need to be taken to reach the goal and their particular dream. Very simple, very informal. We sat around in a lounge, in a circle, 15 to 20 people. And then we would just start going around the room, everybody share their story. Quite a thing for some politicians to have to do 19 bits of listening before they can do one bit of talking. But let me tell you, several of them said, as they were listening, because they were hearing enemies talk, that I am already a changed person within the last 5 hours, as they heard the enemy talking. Because what happened was that the enemy then became humanized, the enemy became demythologized, the stereotypes of the enemy began to break. And it was really incredible. And then interspersing in all of this, we decided that we needed to have some fun. And so in between the sessions, we went off on game drives. And yet, so you'd see the sort of PAC guy and a Nationalist Party cabinet member sitting next to each other on the Land Rover, looking at a rhino or something. And one of the ANC leaders, in fact, he was Central Committee of the Communist Party, he said he'd never been in a game park before. And when we came to a thing of rhino droppings, rhinos make these middens, he just thought this was awesome. And he said, I want to take this back to show it to Nelson Mandela. So he gets off the Land Rover and he gets one of these pads of rhino dropping, things that are the size of a pawpaw or something. And I had visions of him going into Nelson's office the next week, Uncle Nelson saying, what was the weekend like? And he said, here it is. But it was just phenomenal seeing the scales fall off people's eyes and relationships come. Now, remember at that time, the big thing in the Kempton Park meetings was reaching what they call sufficient consensus. Some of you may remember that term. Everybody had to try and get sufficient consensus on issues. And when you got sufficient consensus, then you could move forward. So one evening coming back from one of these game drives, one of the PAC politician, boss person, looked up into into a tree over there, and there was a dark object in the tree. And so he said, "See that? It's an eagle." So Donnie Scritter, who was the Minister for the Interior in the National Party, he said, "No, it's a monkey." Frank Mlalose, who was the boss person of the Inkatha Freedom Party, he said, "Yes, it's a monkey." So one of them said, "Do we have sufficient consensus to decide that it is a monkey?" And they all said yes, at which point the monkey flew away. But I suppose the really awesome thing about, all of this was that as people heard one another's stories, they were challenged in their own consciences and often changed. For example, one of the leaders of the PAC, he arrived just after the PAC had blown up the sports club in King Williamstown. You could almost say dripping with blood. You can imagine the feelings amongst whites there and cabinet ministers, National Party MPs, and so forth. And then he began to tell his story. And he shared how he had been some 20 years on Robben Island with Nelson Mandela and others. And he told some of the vicissitudes of all of that. He'd lost an eye on the island. I mean, he really had gone through it. And then he told us how one day some white warders made him dig a hole 6 feet deep, and then they made him climb into it. And then they filled up the hole until the sand was right up to his neck and just his head sticking out. And then they all urinated on him. Now, beloved, I want to tell you, when we heard that, us whites there, and including those National Party politicians and Afrikaner right-wing extremists, when we heard that, we said, if that had happened to us, you know what we would say? We would say, one settler, one bullet. It was a total light bulb moment for everybody there. And we saw and we realized, what some black people had gone through. And then it was interesting when some of the Afrikaner leadership shared how they feared being under black rule or brown rule or anybody else's rule after being under British rule, particularly at the end of the Boer War. And one of them, who was busy trying to, leading the Afrikaner Volksunie, and numbers of their leaders came. He said, my grandfather told me after the Boer War about how he was required by British soldiers in Pretoria to walk around Pretoria with a sign around his neck saying, I am a donkey, I cannot speak English. And so he said, our people decided we were never ever again going to be stood on or oppressed by any other group. Not by blacks, not by browns, not by English, not by anybody. So we decided to have apartheid. And so for some of the early apartheid ideologists, there was, I hesitate to use the word legitimacy, but there was some integrity in thinking that they could find a system where everybody had their own sort of plek, as it were, their own place. And it wasn't just all the mechanisms of oppression and discrimination, although there was, we acknowledge a lot of that. But I remember a guy from the Central Committee of the Communist Party going to him and say, how can we in the Communist Party and the ANC make space for Afrikaners like you who feel like this? But the interesting thing was that almost all the leaders of the Afrikaner Volksunie, who then went back to their party, and they said, we've had an experience that has changed and transformed us. We don't believe we need a separate Volksstaat. And the party collapsed. I mean, those experiences. And then almost all of them went back to Constant Viljoen, who had 250,000 people under arms and ready to move, and said, Constant, there's another way. We do not have to take arms in this thing and destabilize the whole situation. And Donnie Schutter, who was in charge of the elections as it came up, the Minister of Interior, he said, no one will know the influence of Kolobe Lodge and those weekends on the far right wing. So it was incredible. I remember speaking in where it was, 1998, I think it was, at a reconciliation conference in Coventry Cathedral. And who should be there speaking about reconciliation and love and the way of Jesus Christ than the PAC leader who had been urinated on and who had found love at Kolobe Lodge. The Communist Party Central Committee guy wrote to us after the weekend, said, I rejected Jesus Christ years ago because of what was done to me by white farmers. But he said, please send me any evangelistic books you've got. I want to explore Jesus again because I've never had a weekend with so much love showered on me. So, you know, dear ones, what this did was it brought home to us the power of the relational. Not that everybody left agreed on everything, but people left friends. They'd arrived enemies, they left friends. And so it was that these things went right up to the end of 93, until we find ourselves into early 94. And curiously, in spite of these and other endeavors from many people, as we entered early 94, the situation seemed to be going from bad to worse. In Natal, in the area round about where we live, about 20 people a day were dying, about 70 every weekend, in our area alone, not the country. And it was really, really, really hotting up. And at that point, the notion entered our minds about a brother we had met some years previously on some South African assignments that we'd been working on. Actually meetings we held outside the country with leaders, but he came to these. His name was Washington Akumu, Professor Washington Akumu from Kenya. He was an economist, a political theorist. He'd studied under Henry Kissinger at Harvard. He was a man of diplomatic skill and ability, and he was a committed Christian. We said, Washington, won't you come in here? We have an awesome set of relationships that we have established. But we feel it needs an outside and an external black presence who understands the players, and he knew Mandela and he knew de Klerk and all of these, to come in and see what you can do with some bridge building and facilitating. And so we brought Washington Akumu in 3 times. The stories of those journeys are in my little book. And what we basically tried to do was to hook him up to the legacy of relationships out of the Kolobe Lodge weekends. As we moved towards the time of the election, and the situation still continued to deteriorate, and one of the chapters there, where it's just basically a chapter of news headlines, you will say to yourself, however was a civil war avoided, when you see all that was going on. But at that time, so desperate was President de Klerk, then President de Klerk, Dr. Nelson Mandela and Minister Mangosuthu Buthelezi, that they decided to call in international mediators led by Henry Kissinger and Lord Carrington, the former British Foreign Secretary. And about 10 or 12 of the best mediators in the world. And they arrived in South Africa on the 12th of April 1994, and the elections are 2 weeks away. We were very thrilled when de Klerk, Buthelezi and Mandela said they would like to have Washington Akumu an advisor to the process. We were thrilled. And we felt that he knew more about it than almost anybody else, because he was talking to all the people who weren't talking to each other. And he'd had this legacy of relationships, and we had focused tremendous prayer into him. So it was great when, he was invited to be an advisor to the process. The whole first night he sat up almost with Henry Kissinger, trying to explain to him a bit about South Africa. Kissinger was completely at sea. And I remember meeting him one morning and saying, Dr. Kissinger, we're praying for you. And his eyes just about started out of his head. But he seemed appreciative that people would pray. Whether he thought the prayer would help, I'm not quite sure. But I'm sure they all felt, well, their diplomatic skills and all of that would carry the day. Well, the mediating process got underway on the 13th of April. And on the evening of the 14th of April, Washington Akumu phoned me. And he said the peace discussions have broken down, have collapsed. Kissinger says Armageddon is going to be here in a couple of weeks. And he's going home. Carrington is going home. Everyone's going home to Australia, Canada, and around the world. And I'm going back to Nairobi. And we said to him, on the phone conversation, I'll never forget that night, listen, you can't go. Too much prayer has been put into you. Too much has been invested into you. The country is praying. All the others can go, but you can't. And so he agreed after that phone call to stay. And the very next day, Buthelezi was heading back to Natal to see the king, and he went off to their private aeroplane out in Lanseria Airport. And Akumu woke up thinking, well, I need to see Buthelezi quickly and immediately. Then he found out Buthelezi had already left for the airport. Everything was so urgent, you know, and that it was all a matter of hours. You couldn't wait days and so forth. I have to see him now. And so Washington Akumu jumped in a car to race off to Lanseria Airport, only to get there and find, or just before he got there, I think by cell phone, they found out that the Buthelezi had left. Anyway, I don't know, something made him press on, and he did press on out to the airport, or maybe they said he's about to leave. And Akumu raced off there. Meantime, Buthelezi in his plane had taken off to go back to Natal and talk to the king of the Zulus about what had happened. And when the aeroplane had been 9 minutes away from Lanseria, the compass began to gyrate violently. And it wasn't life-threatening, but you're not allowed to keep flying if you've got a faulty compass. And we were told that had it been 1 minute later when the pilot made the decision, he would have been deflected to another airport. But at 9 minutes, it was back to Lanseria. And so he flew back to Lanseria, and as he got back there, Akumu was flying in his car like sort of Michael Schumacher, you know. And they sat down while the mechanics worked on the compass to have a very, very awesome and strategic and significant discussion. The interesting thing was that as the mechanics examined the compass, every one of them concluded there was no mechanical fault with the compass at all. Compass was absolutely normal, functioning normally. I spoke to the pilot on the plane. I said, what happened to the compass? He said it was an act of God because Buthelezi and Akumu needed to get together at that moment, that morning. It was an incredibly important conversation. From that conversation, Akumu moved back to Mandela, back to de Klerk, back to different groups, and began to come up with a plan. As Buthelezi and Nkumu parted company that day, they made an agreement to meet in Durban at the Kings Park Rugby Stadium the following Sunday, where we had called a Jesus Peace Rally, a prayer rally for the country. So explosive was the situation that a match between New South Wales rugby team and the Sharks set for that Saturday afternoon, the Saturday before the prayer meeting, they all cancelled because they were too fearful of getting large numbers of people together in Kings Park Stadium in a Civil War environment. And, so the match was cancelled. We said, we're not cancelling anything. It just saves us clearing up all the mess after a rugby match before our prayer meeting next day. So we didn't know what was going to happen. We didn't know whether 300 or 3,000. In the event, 25,000 people turned out for the prayer meeting in what was effectively a Civil War environment. That morning, Buthelezi and Akumu met at a hotel in Durban, and they were coming onto the prayer meeting. Just before they came, Dr. Mandela called Nkumu and said, please come to Cape Town. So Nkumu said, I'm going to have to miss the prayer meeting. Let me go to Mandela in Cape Town. Buthelezi came onto the prayer meeting. In the VIP lounge, also, as the rally continued, Buthelezi was there, Nkumu down in Cape Town, but Dr. Dani Schutte, the Minister of Home Affairs and in charge of the election, he was there. Dr. Jacob Zuma, and now our Vice President representing Mandela, he was there. The incredible thing was, as people called on the Lord in that stadium, I've hardly ever heard people call on the Lord, in the VIP lounge up there, Nkumu's draft statement was being studied by Mr. Jacob Zuma, by Dani Schutte, by Minister Buthelezi, and a sort of a meeting of minds began to converge on this document. It was absolutely incredible. And in point of fact, as Buthelezi called the Central Committee of his party, as Mr. Schutte called President de Klerk, as Nkumu was meeting with Mandela, by about 8:45 that night, there was a kind of a convergence on this document. And I remember that night feeling a sense of heaviness and almost depression, actually, after preaching that day. But now, suddenly I felt this sort of lift. And as I said, Lord, what's happening? I had a sense of the Lord saying to me, a stronghold has been broken and has come down. And a meeting of minds had taken place. The very next day, the 18th of April, was just a week or so to go before the elections. I's were dotted, T's were crossed, and on Tuesday, April 19th, then President de Klerk, Dr. Mandela, Minister Buthelezi announced to the world that they had found a way through for peaceful elections in South Africa with just a week to go until the elections. It was an incredible defining moment for all of our lives and certainly in my own, to realize God had done it. Something we couldn't do, He had done in an awesome, totally extraordinary and amazing way. And I'm told that in newspaper rooms, journalists reached for the language of faith. And there were holy hush in those rooms. And the word miracle was used at the top of editorial after editorial. The Natal Daily News had a big headline, "The Day God Stepped In to Save South Africa." The Wall Street Journal carried a full-page article, "God and Politics." The BBC that next day, said the Jesus Peace Rally tipped the scales. In the British House of Commons, they said, if there are miracles in politics, this is one. Time magazine said history has thrown up an authentic miracle. And the next few days were incredible. And Carter had said they'd never come in unless they had 3 months to campaign. They only had 6 days. 84 million ballot papers were adjusted. Parliament met in an unprecedented way the day before an election. And God had done His thing and peace had broken out in South Africa. As we came into the election on the 26th, 27th, and 28th, we had 3 of the most peaceful days in the history of South Africa. And Natal, where we were, 20 people are dying a day, 70 every weekend. There was not a single crime of any sort, not even petty theft, for 3 or 4 days. Nothing, just peace broke out across our nation. And we knew that God had done something. And I'll never forget, on the morning of the 27th, after my wife Carol and our domestic helper and I had voted, I went back home, and suddenly into our yard came 2 or 3 big government cars, and it was Minister Dani Schutte, who had been in charge of the elections, and a sort of a police entourage. And he said, I just want to say something. I want to say that everything that money, power, politics, people, personalities could do was done and failed. And I know, as the man running this election, that what enabled it to happen was the power and the work of the living God. And he said, for me, the miracle began the night you called me, 10 p.m. late at night, to your home to meet Washington Akumu. And from there on out, a whole new dynamic entered the process, new relationships, new factors, new dimensions of the equation. And so, dear ones, what we knew was that God had done something when all of us had failed, when everything that humans could do had been done. And we knew that God came in and worked his own miracle of grace and power and saving love. And yes, dear ones, this is part of the baton we hand you, the legacy that comes from the generation above you, and certainly what comes to you from the Lord, or the miracle of what God did in our elections in 1994. We hand this to you to encourage and steward, and we would never say as South Africans, we did it. Yes, there were amazing politicians, there were wonderful businessmen, there were amazing young people, there were incredible academics, all of that. But at the end of the day, this was something God did.